Noddy, Noddy, the little man in his red and yellow car. Bing, bang, bong. Right, shut up, King. It is time to get serious. She filled childhood with wonder. She sparked imaginations with talking trees, secret islands, and midnight feasts. She created heroes who were brave, curious, loyal, and always ready for adventure. She wrote with a speed and power that critics mocked, but millions of children adored. Her books became a cornerstone of British childhood, shaping generations decade after decade. But behind the magical worlds were shadows of her own. A fractured family life, accusations of elitism and bias, bitter controversies, and a public image that was far more complicated than her sunny stories suggested. Loved fiercely, criticised loudly, and impossible to ignore, she remains one of the most influential and debated children's author of all time. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the fantastical, controversial, world-changing life of Enid Blyton. Okay guys, welcome back to the Author Files. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode on John Steinbeck. He was certainly an interesting figure. But this week, we're going to be stepping into the world of magic, mischief, and midnight feasts. Enid Blyton is a name that instantly sparks nostalgia for so many of us. But the woman behind the famous five and the Faraway Tree was far more complex than the cheerful world she created. In this episode, we're going to go right back to the beginning, her childhood, the inspirations that shaped her, the fractures within her family, and the twists and turns that led her to become one of the most prolific and controversial children's authors of all time. So settle in, grab a ginger beer, and let's explore the life of Enid Blyton. Enid Mary Blyton was born on the 11th of August 1897 in East Dulwich, South London. She was born at 354 Lordship Lane, which was a two-bedroom flat above a shop. Her parents were Thomas Carey Blyton, and her mother was Theresa Mary. Enid's father Thomas was a cutlery salesman as a young man. However, as he got older, he would join his uncle's firm selling Yorkshire cloth and would ultimately go on to set up his own business as a clothing wholesaler. Enid had a rather dramatic start to life, as a few months after she was born, she almost died from whooping cough. Whooping cough is basically a 100-day cough that is highly contagious and can be very fatal in infants. But luckily, she was nursed back to health by her father, who she absolutely adored. After Enid and her parents had moved to Beckenham, which was a village in Kent, Enid's two young brothers would come along, Hanley in 1899 and Carey in 1902. Enid's father, Thomas, would ignite Enid's interest in nature and writing. And in fact, in her autobiography, which she would later write, she said of her father that he loved flowers and birds and wild animals and knew more about them than anyone I had ever met. And what was more, he was willing to take me with him on his expeditions and share his love and knowledge with me. But it wasn't just nature that Thomas passed down onto his daughter. He also passed on his other interests, such as gardening, art, music, literature, theatre, and it is said that Enid and her father would often go on nature walks, much to the disapproval of Enid's mother, who reportedly never showed much interest in Enid's likes or passions. Enid began her school days at a small school run by two sisters in a house called Tresco, not Tesco, Tresco, which was only a short walk from her house. Enid spoke about her time at this school, saying, "I remember everything about it. The room, the garden, the pictures on the wall, the little chairs, the dog there, and the lovely smells that used to creep out from the kitchen into our classroom when we were sat doing dictation. I remember how we used to take biscuits for our mid-morning lunch and swap them with one another, and how we used to dislike one small boy who was clever at swapping a small biscuit for a big one. I'd say that boy was onto a good deal. Enid's time at Tresco was a happy one. She was said to have been a bright girl, blessed with a good memory. However, she was said to have been terrible at mathematics. Do you know what? I think a lot of us are terrible at mathematics at school. Obviously, if you're listening to this and you're very good at mathematics, then hooray for you. But I feel like the overarching majority of us were just absolutely rubbish. I know I certainly was. Enid loved books as a girl, and some of her favourites included Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies, and Louisa M. Alcott's Little Women. She'd later go on to speak of the characters in Little Women, saying, "Those were real children. When I grow up, I will write books about real children," I thought. That's the kind of book I like best. That's the kind of book I would know how to write. She also enjoyed Lewis Carroll's Alice books and R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island. However, one book she didn't enjoy was Grimm's Fairy Tales, saying that she found them cruel and frightening. In 1907, and for the next 8 years, Enid would attend St. Christopher's School in Beckenham, where she enjoyed physical activities and would go on to become the school tennis champion and lacrosse captain. She would also organise concerts, play practical jokes, and was awarded prizes in various subjects. In 1910, at the age of 13, Enid was left devastated when her father decided to leave the family to live with another woman. He would later go on to have more children with this woman. Thomas and Teresa had very little in common, and because of this, they grew increasingly unhappy and frustrated in their marriage as the years passed. It is said that they had frequent rows with Enid and her 2 brothers, often sitting at the top of the stairs with their arms around each other, listening to their parents' heated arguments. Her father's leaving was difficult for Enid to accept, and as marital breakdown was regarded as a scandal in 1910, Teresa forced Enid and her brothers to pretend, if asked, that their father was merely away on a visit. This resulted with Enid in later years to have a lifelong tendency to cover up anything unpleasant and to always put on a facade. And this is what we'll see as we go on. As we go on to learn more about Enid's life, she did exactly that. While Enid was at school, she wasn't particularly keen on the academic subjects which she had to study, but she did excel in writing, and because of this, she entered Arthur Mee's children's poetry competition. Mee would later go on to print her verses and encouraged her to print more. Unfortunately, Teresa, Enid's mother, considered her efforts at writing to be a waste of money, but Enid was encouraged to continue by Mabel Attenborough, who was the aunt of Enid's school friend, Mary Potter. Enid's father, in her early years, taught Enid to play the piano. His sister Mary was a professional musician, and he'd hoped that Enid would follow in her footsteps. Enid had mastered the piano, and as her time at school came to a close, she considered enrolling at the Guildhall School of Music, but later decided that she would prefer to become a writer, so any idea of pursuing a musical career ended there. In 1915, Enid successfully finished school and completed her studies as being head girl. Once school was done, she decided to move out of the family home to live with her friend Mary. It's important to note that it is believed that after Enid left school and left home, that she never saw her mother again, and if she was asked about her mother, Enid would give people the impression that her mother was dead. Although Enid adored her father, Enid's relationship with her mother was more turbulent. Teresa's life revolved around housework. She was not creative or artistic, and she expected Enid to help with the household chores, but she would give her sons a lot more freedom. This is something that Enid resented. Enid would go on not to attend either of her parents' funerals. Enid would go on to stay with George and Emily Hunt at Sackford Hall near Woodbridge in Suffolk. Sackford Hall was said to have been haunted and had secret passageways which would eventually provide inspiration for Enid's later stories. Settling in Woodbridge, Enid would attend the Woodbridge Congregational Church, and it's there where she met Ida Hunt, who was a teacher at Ipswich High School. Ida would suggest to Enid that she should train at the school as a teacher. Enid would also later be introduced to the children at the local nursery school, and recognizing her natural affinity with them, she enrolled in the National Throwbell Union teacher training course at the school in September 1916. Throughout the training, Enid would continue to write, and she even sent some manuscripts to potential publishers. However, her manuscripts were unfortunately rejected by publishers on many occasions, which only made her more determined to succeed. Speaking of this, Enid said, "It is partly the struggle that helps you so much, that gives you the determination, character, self-reliance, all things that help in any professional trade, and most certainly in writing." During this time, Enid had completely cut contact with her mother. However, she kept in touch with her father, often visiting him at his office in London. But Enid could never bring herself to accept his new wife Florence, and because of this, Enid and her father were not as close as they once had been. The work published by Arthur Mee has never been traced, but in 1917 Enid had written a poem called Have You? And it was accepted for publication by Nash's magazine. Because the work published by Arthur Mee cannot be found, Have You is the first recorded publication of Enid's work. Proving to be an inventive and energetic teacher, and after completing her teacher training in December 1918, Enid would go on to teach a year at a boys' preparatory school. I don't know why I couldn't say that. Preparatory school in Kent called Bickley Park School. Upon completion of her teacher training, Enid became a governess to four brothers, the Thompson brothers, who were relatives of Mabel's, at a house called Savernhay in Surrey. Enid would spend 4 years in this position, and during her time there, children from neighbouring families would come to join her experimental school. Enid would later say that this was one of the happiest times in her life. 1920 would be tough for Enid, as during this year, Enid's father sadly passed away suddenly. Originally, Enid was told that he had suffered a heart attack while fishing along the Thames. However, this would prove to be false, as Thomas had actually suffered a stroke and died in his armchair at his home in Sunbury, where he lived with his wife and new family. It's believed that his true cause of death was not made public owing to the fact that Teresa had been so secretive about the breakdown of their marriage. Sadly, Enid decided not to attend her father's funeral. She didn't even mention his death to the Thompsons, who she was working for at the time. It's believed that having cut herself off from her family, she did not feel up to dealing with such a difficult and emotional occasion and preferred not to have been asked awkward questions from either her family or her employers. Or perhaps this was her way of coping. After all, she had been taught from a young age to shut away her feelings. In 1921, Enid would win the Saturday Westminster Review writing competition after submitting an essay titled "On the Popular Fallacy that to the Pure all things are pure." This led to other publications such as The Londoner, Home Weekly, and The Bystander to show an interest in her short stories and poems. The next year, in 1922, Enid's first book, Child Whispers, a 24-page collection of poems, was released, with Enid's school friend Phyllis Chase being the illustrator. Also in 1922, Enid would begin writing in annuals for Cassell and George Noons, and her first piece of writing, Perronel and His Pot of Glue, was accepted for publication in Teacher's World. This would be a big step for Enid, as in the following year, in 1923, her poems would appear alongside work by famed writers such as Rudyard Kipling, Walter de la Mare, and G.K. Chesterton in a special issue of Teacher's World. In the July of 1923, Enid would publish Real Fairies, a collection of 33 poems, and the following year, in 1924, the Enid Blyton Book of Fairies would be published, illustrated by Horace J. Knowles, and in 1926, the Book of Brownies would follow. Now, at this point in Enid's life, we're going to meet her first husband. So now enters Hugh Alexander Pollock, the man who would become Enid's first husband. When Enid was commissioned by publishing company George Newnes to write a children's book about London Zoo, Enid met the editor at the book department called Hugh, and the two fell in love. Who was Hugh? Well, at the beginning of World War I, he joined the Royal Scots Fusiliers and would go on to be awarded a DSO, a Distinguished Service Order, in 1919. His first marriage ended after his wife had had an affair. He had to obtain a divorce in order to marry Enid, and that's exactly what he did. As shortly after Enid had completed the commission and the zoo book was published, Enid and Hugh got married on the 28th of August, 1924. Their wedding took place at Bromley Register Office and was a quiet occasion, with no member of Enid's or Hugh's family attending the ceremony. They then honeymooned in Jersey, where Enid would later base Kieran in the famous 5 books on an island, castle and village they visited there. After the honeymoon, Enid and Hugh lived first of all in an apartment in Chelsea, and then they moved to their first house, a new built elfin cottage in Beckenham, in 1926. Between the 1920s and 30s, Enid would work on a number of educational books, and in 1926, she would begin writing and editing a fortnightly magazine titled Sunny Stories for Little Folks. It would later in 1937 become a weekly publication and would change its name to the Enid Blyton Sunny Stories, later just becoming Sunny Stories. Enid's first full-length novel would follow, titled The Enid Blyton Book of Bunnies. It was published in 1925, although it was later retitled to The Adventures of Binkle and Flip, and can be described as an episodic book, reading more like a collection of individual stories about 2 mischievous rabbits. However, as mentioned earlier, Enid's The Enid Blyton Book of Brownies would, to many, be known as her first proper novel. Up until 1927, Enid had always written her manuscripts in longhand. However, Hugh persuaded her to start using a typewriter. Hugh would prove to be an invaluable source to Enid, helping her to establish herself as a writer and teaching her about contracts and the business side of being a writer. Enid and Hugh lived a quiet and peaceful life in the early years of their marriage, with Hugh indulging in Enid's playful, childlike side. They would build snowmen together, play catch and French cricket in the garden, and participate in games of conkers. Outside of these fun moments, the pair would enjoy gardening, outings to the theatre or cinema, and they would enjoy going on seaside holidays. In 1929, Enid and Hugh would move to Old Thatch, which was a 16th century thatched cottage with a lovely garden near the River Thames in Bourne End, Buckinghamshire. The cottage had once been an inn, and it's said that Dick Turpin was supposedly meant to have slept there, and he also apparently stabled his horse Blackbreast in one of the stables. Another interesting fact about this cottage is that it's said that there was hidden treasure somewhere on the premises, although the treasure has never been found. Enid described Old Thatch as being like a house in a fairy tale. After moving in, Enid and Hugh enjoyed a much busier social life, attending dinner parties and enjoying tennis and bridge. In October 1930, they went on a cruise to Madeira and the Canary Islands aboard the Stella Polaris. Also in 1930, Enid developed a love and an interest in writing stories related to various myths from ancient Greece and Rome. That year, she would publish 3 books: The Knights of the Round Table, Tales of Ancient Greece, and Tales of Robin Hood. In Tales of Ancient Greece, Enid retold 16 well-known ancient Greek myths. However, she would use Latin rather than Greek names and would also invent conversations between characters. Enid would also, later, go on to release The Adventures of Odysseus, Tales of the Ancient Greeks and Persians, and Tales of the Romans in 1934. Enid and Hugh initially had trouble starting a family, but eventually, on the 15th of July 1931, Enid would give birth to her first child, a daughter who they named Gillian. They would go on to have another daughter, Imogen, who was born on the 27th of October 1935, after a miscarriage in 1934. 1934 would not only bring personal troubles for Enid, but also become a very productive year. As well as releasing 3 further books based on her love of ancient myths, Enid would write the first of 28 books in Enid's Old Thatch series, The Talking Teapot and Other Tales. In 1938, Enid would publish the first full-length adventure book, The Secret Island. The Secret Island featured characters Jack, Mike, Peggy, and Nora. It was described by the Glasgow Herald as a Robinson Crusoe-style adventure on an island in an English lake. The secret lake would become a favourite of Gillian's, Enid's eldest daughter, and would first go on to become a series of novels. In the previous year, Enid had written The Wonderful Adventure, but that book was considered a novella rather than a full-length story. At this point, Enid was given more and more of her time to writing, relying increasingly on domestic stuff, housework, gardening, and childcare. Because of her writing, Enid unfortunately did not have a lot of time for her children. She would play with the girls for an hour after tea time and would sometimes take Imogen out to meet Gillian from school. So, at this point, we're going to take a break in the timeline to discuss the downfall of Enid's first marriage. So, buckle in, because all I can say to you right now is that this gets a little bit juicy. So, problems in her marriage with Hugh started to develop, with Hugh and Enid respectively both busy with their work. While Enid continued to write her stories, Hugh was busy working with Winston Churchill on his writings about the First World War. Unfortunately, with the realization that another world war was just around the corner, Hugh fell into a deep depression and started drinking secretly in a cubbyhole beneath the stairs. It's believed that the threat of another war reawakened the trauma Hugh had suffered during the First World War. When World War II came along, Hugh became involved in the Home Guard, and it was here that he became reacquainted with an aspiring writer he had met years earlier named Ida Crow. Upon meeting her again, Hugh had offered her a job to join him as a secretary in his posting to the Home Guard Training Centre at Dembles in Surrey. They would eventually go on to begin a romantic relationship. Yes, it would appear that Enid's and Hugh's relationship was troubled and strained for many years. When Ida Crow wrote her memoirs, she wrote about how Enid had a series of affairs, including lesbian relationships with one of the children's nannies and with Lola Onslow, who had illustrated Enid's 1924 book, The Enid Blyton Book of Fairies. In 1941, Enid would meet a man named Kenneth Fraser Darrell Waters, a London-based surgeon with whom she began a serious affair. When Hugh discovered this, he threatened to initiate divorce proceedings. With Hugh's threat firmly in Enid's mind, she was worried how the public scandal of her adultery would alter her public image. So it was decided that Enid would instead file for divorce against Hugh. According to Ida's memoirs, Enid had promised Hugh that if he had admitted to infidelity, She would allow him parental access to their daughters, but after the divorce, he was denied contact with them, and Enid had made sure he was unable to find further work in publishing. So I guess the lesson here is to not mess with Enid at all. During the Second World War, Enid remained productive despite her marital issues. In the 1940s, Enid became a prolific writer. In 1940, Enid published 2 books, Three Boys in a Circus and a second titled Children of Kidlin. However, she published these under the pseudonym of Mary Pollock. She also publishes a further 11 titles under her name that year. However, Enid would soon regret using a pseudonym as she began to realise her readers were not so easily deceived, and many people complained about the subterfuge to her and her publisher. The result was that all 6 books published under her pseudonym were reissued in Enid's name. Later that year, Enid would release the first novel in the Naughtiest Girl series. The Naughtiest Girl in the School followed the exploits of the mischievous schoolgirl Elizabeth Allen at the fictional Whiteleaf School. In 1941, the first of her 6 novels in the St. Clair's series, The Twins at St. Clair's, was released, featuring twin sisters Patricia and Isabel O'Sullivan. In 1942, Enid would release the first book in the Mary Mouse series, Mary Mouse and the Doll's House, which was about a mouse exiled from her mouse hole who becomes a maid at a doll's house. 23 of these books would be produced between 1942 and 1964, and in 1942, 10,000 copies of them were sold. The same year would see the beginning of what could be considered Enid's most popular work, the famous 5 series. The first novel, titled 5 on a Treasure Island, would feature illustrations by Eileen Soper, and its popularity would result in 21 books in the series being published between 1942 and 1963. The characters of Julian, Dick, Anne, George, and Timmy the dog would go on to become household names in Britain. Children's literature author Matthew Grenby would state that the 5 were involved with unmasking hardened villains and solving serious crimes, although the novels were hardly hard-boiled thrillers. I would argue with that critique by saying that the famous 5 books were meant for children, so I wouldn't ever class them as hard-boiled thrillers. Enid would, Enid would later reveal that she based the character of Georgina, on herself. She described George as being a tomboy who was short-haired, freckled, sturdy, and snub-nosed, while being bold and daring, hot-tempered, and loyal. In 1943, Enid wrote and released the first book in her 5 Find Outers series, titled The Mystery of the Burnt Cottage. Also that year, the second in the Faraway series, The Magic Faraway Tree, was released. And in 2003, The Magic Faraway Tree would be voted 66th in a poll to find the UK's favourite book. Enid would also marry her second husband, Kenneth, on the 20th of October 1943 at the City of Westminster Register Office. Their wedding took place 6 days before Hugh's wedding to Ida. At this point, Gillian and Imogen had not seen their father since 1942, and sadly, they never would again. Enid had cut her former husband out of her life, just as she had done with her mother. Many speculate that this was her pretending to herself that neither had existed. In doing this, you could determine that she was continuing a pattern of behaviour where she would grapple with pretense and denial, skills she had learnt in childhood, almost as if she was making a fiction of her own life. Photographs later released in her autobiography would show herself, her second husband Kenneth, Gillian and Imogen with the caption, "Happy Little Family." Throughout the autobiography there is no mention of Hugh, and although it is not explicitly stated, readers are given the impression that Kenneth is the girl's father. Kenneth, who, as mentioned before, was a surgeon at St. Stephen's Hospital in Chelsea, London, was said to have been a very active man who enjoyed gardening, tennis, and golf. However, it was also said that he could sometimes come across as rude and insensitive at times, but this could be explained by an incident which occurred during the First World War. During the First World War, Kenneth was serving in the Navy. When his ship torpedoed at the Battle of Jutland, it caused permanent damage to his hearing. Enid and Kenneth were very proud of their achievements and were said to have been very happy together. However, in the spring of 1945, Enid would discover that she was pregnant, but sadly would suffer another miscarriage 5 months later. This resulted from a fall from a ladder. The baby would have been Kenneth's first child, and it would have also been a baby boy, for which both of them longed for. In 1948, the two of them would go on their only holiday abroad, when they joined friends for a 3-week semi-business holiday in New York, sailing on the Queen Elizabeth and back on the Queen Mary. Although this was their only ever holiday overseas together, the two of them would frequently take holidays in Dorset, where they would go on to purchase a golf course and a farm. Now, is there a more iconic and instantly recognisable children's character than Noddy? I think not. And it's in this next section that Noddy appears. So, I'll have to admit to you that when I was very young, one of my first major likes was Noddy on the telly. And I remember not wanting to leave the house before watching Noddy. I also remember having loads of Noddy toys, Noddy books, Noddy games. We'd also go on holiday to Butlins and they'd have the Noddy aeroplanes. So yeah, I was just absolutely Noddy obsessed. Okay, so on the 5th of June 1949, Noddy would make his first appearance in the Sunday graphic. Noddy, the titular character, was a story about a little wooden boy from Toyland. In the November of the same year, the first of at least 24 of books in the Noddy series was published, and the first book was Noddy Goes to Toyland. Noddy was originally an idea put forth to Enid by her publishers in 1949. They had arranged a meeting between Enid and the Dutch illustrator Harmsen van der Beek. Although these meetings were tricky, with an interpreter having to attend, Harmsen provided some initial sketches of how Toyland and its characters should be represented. 4 days after this meeting, Enid had sent the manuscripts for the first 2 Noddy books to her publisher, so they would forward them to Harmsen. Noddy would go on to become one of Enid's most successful and best-known series, especially popular in the 50s. It would also launch Enid into the world of merchandise. An extensive range of sub-series, spin-offs, and strip books were produced throughout the decade, including Noddy's Library, Noddy's Garage of Books, Noddy's Castle of Books, Noddy's Toy Station of Books, and Noddy's Shop of Books. In fact, over the next 20 years, Noddy would become a financial success. By the early 60s, 146 different companies were involved in merchandising Noddy alone. This included games, jigsaw puzzles, and soft toys. Because of her success, in 1950, Enid established the company Darrell Waters Limited to manage her affairs. During the early 50s, she had reached the peak of her output, often publishing more than 50 books a year, and she would remain prolific throughout much of the next decade. So, for this next section in the episode, we're going to take a look at some criticisms of Enid, which I feel like I have to include as public attitude has majorly changed since the publication of her books, and at times the perception of her works have been frowned upon. So, let's get to it. So, some critics would accuse Enid of writing too simplistically. I can't say that word, can I? Simplistically. There we go, simplistically. In 1958, a scathing article was published in Encounter by journalist Colin Welch. He remarked that it was hard to see how a diet of Miss Blyton could help with the 11 plus or even with the Cambridge English typos. But, and this next remark is very sad, he would go on to absolutely destroy Noddy by describing him as an unnaturally priggish, sanctimonious, witless, spiritless, snivelling, sneaking doll. Well, I don't agree with you, Colin, but let's move on. In 1966, Lena Jaeger would publish an article in The Guardian where Jaeger wrote a critical piece about Enid's 1937 book, The Little Black Doll. The Little Black Doll was a story about a doll named Sambo who is hated by his owner and the other toys because of his ugly black face, and thus Sambo runs away. When he runs away, a shower of magic rain washes his face clean, after which he is welcomed back home, but now with a pink face. Yeah, you can see how that story is problematic. There's no question about it. And it wasn't just racism that Enid had been criticised for, as accusations of xenophobia would follow. In 1960, the publisher Macmillan conducted an internal assessment of Enid's The Mystery That Never Was, which was submitted to them at the height of her fame. The review was carried out by author and books editor Phyllis Hartnell. Hartnell would conclude that there is a faint but unattractive touch to old-fashioned xenophobia in the author's attitude to the thieves. They are foreign, and this seems to be regarded as sufficient to explain their criminality. Because of her conclusion, Macmillan rejected the manuscript. Enid's works would also go on to be considered sexist. In 2005, an article in The Guardian written by Lucy Mangan saw Mangan prose that the famous 5 series depicts a power struggle between Julian, Dick, and Georgie, in which the female characters either act like boys or are talked down to, evidenced when Dick lectures George by saying, "It's really time you gave up thinking you're as good as a boy." As with any critical opinion, it's always good to hear all sides, and many of her readers don't agree with the racial, xenophobic, or sexist occurrences in her novels, but they do point out that the novels are a product of their time. So now that we've covered the criticisms, let's get back to the life of Enid and find out what happened next. In 1952, Enid ended Sunny Stories after 26 years and instead launched a now fortnightly magazine in March 1953 titled Enid Blyton's Magazine. For the magazine, Enid would write all of the contents herself except for the advertisements. Through the magazine, Enid would mould her readership with her stories, editorials, and news pages, encouraging her child audience to be kind, helpful, and responsible, impressing upon them that if they use their initiative, they could do their bit and make a difference to society, whatever their age. Through this magazine, she would also promote clubs that children could join. For example, she recommended the Busy Bees, which helped animals, the famous 5 Club, which raised money for a children's home, the Sunbeam Society, which helped blind children, and the Magazine Club, which raised money for children who had spastic cerebral palsy. The result of this promotion was thousands of readers joining the multiple clubs. Enid would later speak proudly about the army of children who were helping her to carry out the work she wanted to do. The magazine would last 6 years before it ended in September 1959, as Enid wished to spend more time with Kenneth, who retired from his work as a surgeon in 1957. By the time of the publication's end, the 4 clubs had approximately 500,000 members between them and had raised £35,000 throughout the 6 years, which was an enormous amount of money for the time. In the late 1950s, Enid's health would begin to deteriorate. She would experience bouts of breathlessness and had suffered a suspected heart attack. By the early 60s, it became apparent to Enid and those around her that she was suffering from dementia. Her mind was no longer sharp, and she would often become confused, afflicted by worrying memory lapses, and had become seized by a desire to return to her childhood home in Beckenham with both of her parents. Despite this, many of Enid's series, including Noddy and The Famous Five, continued to be successful in the 60s, so much so that by 1962, 26 million copies of Noddy had been sold. Enid would conclude several of her long-running series in 1963, publishing the last books of The Famous Five, with Five Are Together Again, and The Secret Seven, with Fun for the Secret Seven. She would also go on to produce 3 more of her Brer Rabbit books. After 1963, Enid's output was generally confined to short stories and books intended for very young readers. In 1964, she would publish her last Noddy book, Noddy and the Aeroplane, and in 1965, books such as Learn to Count with Noddy and Learn to Tell the Time with Noddy would be published. Unfortunately, Kenneth was ill too. He had begun suffering from severe arthritis, and the medicine he took for this sadly damaged his kidneys, leading to his death on the 15th of September 1967, leaving Enid alone. After Kenneth's death, Gillian and Imogen, who were both in their 30s, visited their mother regularly and did what they could for her, but sadly, Enid would decline physically and mentally over the next few months. Eventually, Enid would move into a nursing home in Hampstead, North London. However, 3 months after arriving, she would pass away at the age of 71 on the 28th of November, 1968. A memorial service was held at St James Church in Piccadilly, and she was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium, where her ashes remain. In 1971, Enid's home Greenhedges was auctioned and later demolished in 1973. The site now occupies houses in a street named Blyton Close. An English Heritage Blue plaque commemorates Enid at Hook Road in Chessington, where she lived from 1920 to 1924. Another plaque would follow in 2014, when a plaque recording her time as a Beaconsfield resident from 1938 until her death in 1968 was unveiled in the Town Hall Gardens next to small iron figures of Noddy and Big Ears. In 1989, Imogen, Enid's youngest daughter, would release an autobiography titled A Childhood at Greenhedges. However, in the autobiography, Enid was not painted as a nice person. In fact, she is described as being emotionally immature, unstable, and often a malicious figure. Imogen would go on to say this about her mother, that she was arrogant, insecure, pretentious, very skilled at putting difficult or unpleasant things out of her mind, and without a trace of maternal instinct. As a child, I viewed her as a rather strict authority. As an adult, I pitied her. Gillian, Enid's eldest, would paint a different picture altogether, calling her mother a fair and loving mother and a fascinating companion. In 1982, the Enid Blyton Trust for Children was established, with Imogen serving as its first chairman, and in 1985 it established a National Library for the Disabled Child. In 1985, a new magazine was released titled Enid Blyton's Adventure Magazine. On the 14th of October 1992, the BBC began publishing Noddy magazine. In 1993, in Rickmansworth, the first ever Enid Blyton Day was held. And in October 1996, the Enid Blyton Award, known as the Enid, was started, with the award being given to those who have made outstanding contributions towards children. In early 1995, the Enid Blyton Society was formed to provide a focal point for collectors and enthusiasts of Enid Blyton. And Enid's legacy continues to this day. Normally, at this point of the episode, I like to include some fun facts about the author, which I haven't mentioned during the timeline. But unfortunately, it would appear that there aren't many out there from what I've already told you. However, if you are interested in learning more about Enid Blyton and seeing some of Blyton's own papers and typescripts, then I can tell you that in 2010, Seven Stories, which is the National Centre for Children's Books based in Newcastle upon Tyne, they hold the largest public collection of Blyton's papers and typescripts. The collection at Seven Stories contains a significant number of Blyton's typescripts, including the previously unpublished novel Mr. Trumpy's Caravan, as well as personal papers and diaries. The purchasing of the material was made possible by specialist funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund, the MLA Purchase Grant Fund, and two private donations. And this brings us to the end of the extraordinary and often surprising life of Enid Blyton, a woman who filled the childhoods of millions with magic, adventure, and endless possibility, yet whose own life was shaped by turmoil, fractured relationships, and a lifelong habit of hiding the uncomfortable truth she couldn't face. From her early years in East Dulwich and Beckenham, where she clung to the father she adored and struggled under the shadow of a mother she could never quite please, to the heartbreak of watching her family crumble and the quiet decision to build a new identity by shutting the doors behind her, sometimes forever. We followed her through her determined climb into publishing, her tireless work as a teacher, and her almost unbelievable productivity as a writer. Fairies, brownies, secret islands, mischievous schoolgirls, mystery-solving children, and of course a little wooden boy named Noddy. She created worlds at a pace no one could quite understand, let alone match. But behind the bright covers and cheerful characters, there were the complications. A turbulent first marriage, affairs on both sides, and a divorce shaped as much by public image as emotion. A second marriage built on stability and pride, yet shadowed by miscarriages, illness, and eventually the painful decline of both husband and wife. She built clubs that encouraged children to be kind, responsible, and generous. She raised huge amounts for charity, inspired hundreds of thousands to join her causes, and used her magazine to build what she would call her army of children. And yet, the mother who wrote so lovingly for millions struggled deeply within motherhood in her own home, a contrast reflected starkly in the conflicting memories of her daughters. By the 1960s, as her health declined and dementia took its toll, the world she built began slipping away from her, but they never slipped away from us. Even after her death in 1968, her legacy only grew. New editions, TV adaptations, magazines, trusts, societies, plaques, celebrations, and an entire generation of merchandise keep her characters alive. And they are still alive today. Enid Blyton remains complicated, adored, criticised, defended, and debated, but above all, remembered. She wrote about real children with real feelings, and in doing so, she shaped the imaginations of countless young readers across nearly a century. Thank you for spending this time with me exploring her life, both the magic and the messiness, the triumphs and the shadows. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone who once dreamed of joining the famous five or climbing that faraway tree. Honestly, a review, a like, or a follow really will help this little tiny podcast to grow. And I feel like at the end of researching Enid's life, I sort of came to the conclusion that I just don't think she ever grew up. Her whole life was surrounded by children's stories, and as evidenced in her emotional responses to tragic situations like the death of her father, not going to his funeral, and then erasing Hugh out of not only her life, but her daughter's life as well. I just feel like Enid was, well, I've summed up in my own mind that Enid never really grew up emotionally. And maybe we can trace that back to how her mother treated her as a child. But with the woman no longer being here to speak to us herself, I guess we'll never know. So, this concludes the episode today. And next Friday, because you may notice on your podcast platform that it says that new episodes will release bi-weekly. That's not true. They are released every Friday, and you can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube. And please come and join me on my Instagram, which you can find by typing in the Author Files podcast. And come and join in the conversation. Come and tell me which of Enid's works you adored the most. In fact, my housemate, yesterday, she showed me a copy of, I think it was Enid Blyton's 13 Nature Stories that she bought recently. And the cover is absolutely beautiful. So if you're out and about and you go into a bookshop, go and have a look at how beautiful and how lovely Enid's works are still being published today, as they really are a treat for the eyes. And next week, so next Friday, we'll be looking at the works and life of, drumroll please, Edgar Allan Poe. And I promise not to do a little singing intro at the start like I did with this one. Anyway, this has been the Author Files. I am Kane, and this has been the wonderful, complex, and magical life of Enid Blyton. And I will see you guys next week. So stay safe, stay reading, and see ya.